The ceasefire in Gaza hangs in the balance as Israel insists on extending Phase 1. Hamas says it's a breach of their original truce agreement. Benjamin Netanyahu is warning of consequences if the group does not accept. So, will Israel resume its war on Gaza? Or can the ceasefire be salvaged? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Rob Matheson. Palestinians in Gaza were supposed to enter the holy month of Ramadan in some form of peace as the second phase of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas got underway. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government now wants to renegotiate the terms. Israel is pressuring Hamas to extend the first phase of the ceasefire in exchange for releasing half of the remaining 59 captives. And it's cut off aid and supplies to Gaza again. Hamas is accusing Israel of carrying out a coup against the existing deal. It says the international community has to act. Hamas says it wants to continue as agreed with talks on Phase 2 of the ceasefire, and that includes negotiating the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Strip. But Israel appears intent on changing the deal, and it seems to have strong backing from the Trump administration. We're going to speak to our guests in a moment. First, this report by Ferdia Carr.
Surrounded by the ruins of their own homes, Palestinians in Gaza take what joy they can in celebrating the holy month of Ramadan at last without Israeli bombing. But that peace now hangs in the balance. The first 42-day phase of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas ended on Saturday. Israel has now cut off supplies and threatened consequences unless Hamas agrees to new terms. Hamas says that amounts to blackmail. Israel is now endorsing a US plan for an extension of the ceasefire over Ramadan and the Jewish holiday of Passover, rather than entering the agreed second phase. Talks in Phase 2 were meant to negotiate the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and the release of all 59 remaining captives, 24 of whom are believed to still be alive. But Hamas says Israel has refused to engage. A new proposal by US envoy Steve Witkoff would see half of the remaining captives released once an agreement is reached, and the other half when both sides agree a permanent ceasefire. Hamas says allowing Israel to abandon Phase 2 would give it the option to resume fighting once all captives are returned. That's because Israel would effectively ditch Phase 3, aimed at ending hostilities and negotiating the rebuilding of Gaza and its future governance, something Israel has been keen to avoid.
They don't want a Palestinian state. They don't want a binational state. They don't want a confederation. They want a Jewish state in all of Palestine, and they're trying to do it by force. Get the Palestinians out of Gaza, push now out of the West Bank. They've already pushed 50,000 out of the camps, and they're going to try to get them out. But these Palestinians are not going to go anywhere.
The ceasefire brought some reprieve to the more than 2 million people in Gaza whose lives have been wrecked by famine and displacement. And despite repeated Israeli violations, killing more than 100 Palestinians during the truce and blocking entry of shelters, Hamas has been pushing to continue the ceasefire. But with broad backing from the new US Trump administration, Israel appears intent on reshaping it in its own interest. Palestinians across Gaza remain defiant and resilient.
We are here in the midst of destruction and rubble, and we are steadfast despite the pain in our wounds. We are breaking our fast on our land, and we will not leave this place. We will stay here.
Celebrating Ramadan with their surviving family, Palestinians here can only hope for lasting peace. Ferdia Carr, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
We're going to bring in our guests now. In Bethlehem, we have Xavier Abu Eid. He's a political analyst. He's also a former advisor to the PLO and author of the book Rooted in Palestine. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Francis Ricciardone. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Egypt and Turkiye. He's also former president of the American University in Cairo. And in West Jerusalem, we have Gershon Baskin. He's a Middle East director of the NGO, the International Communities Organization. He's also a former peace and hostage negotiator. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Gershon, I want to come to you first. What's your take on this proposal to extend phase one?
I think it's a non-starter. I think it was a non-starter the moment it was presented by the Israeli side to the Americans, to Steve Witkoff, the presidential envoy. And it was very clear from the outset that Hamas would not agree. When they entered into this negotiated deal 44, 45 days ago, it was very clear that Hamas entered the agreement because they understood in phase two it would lead to the end of the war and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Now Israel is trying to renege on that obligation to end the war and withdraw from Gaza. And Hamas, of course, is not going to release the 59 remaining hostages until there is an Israeli guarantee to end the war and withdraw from Gaza.
Javier, let me come to you because there's a statement that's come out from Hamas in which they say they've already signed, as Gershon was saying, a three-stage ceasefire agreement under the auspices of third-party mediators, including the Americans. The understanding from what Gershon was saying that there was never an expectation almost that Hamas was willing to accept this.
Because what's happening at this stage, Rob, and thanks for inviting me here, is that the US and Israel are in violation of the ceasefire deal that was signed a few weeks ago. And I think it's very important to emphasize on this point and also to realize the level of coordination that the US administration, the Trump administration, and the Israeli government have at this stage. It was just a few hours from this US adoption of an Israeli position, which was to extend phase one and not to get to phase two, that led to several Israeli announcements supposedly supported by the US, including halting all humanitarian aid to Gaza at the beginning of Ramadan.
Francis, the way this is being reported, it seems like Israel is essentially saying, right, give us everything you want, that's the deal. Is this actually a negotiation anymore?
Well, it seems like the Israelis are moving the goalposts here. It's clear that in the larger picture, both sides have lost this war. Neither side sees an easy way out. And the United States is trying to work a way in between, at least as a short-term fix on the table to get at least a ceasefire through Ramadan. That would be something. But the problem is that both sides are stuck. They can't get out of this without even worse losses. Hamas has nowhere to go, nothing it can salvage from this war that it unleashed once it were to give up all the hostages. On the Israeli side, they have no plan, no idea of where to go. As a previous commentator has said, they reject a unitary state. They reject two-state solutions. They seem to have enlarged their war aims to removing the Palestinian people from Gaza. That's clearly not going to happen. They seem to be enlarging them to remove people from the West Bank, and that's not going to happen. But both sides are stuck. It seems to me the best that can happen here is for both sides to accept the United States proposal for the short term, at least to get through Ramadan and Passover.
Mm-hmm. Gershon, how much of this do you think this extension by the US and subsequently by Israel is ultimately about avoiding Israel withdrawing its troops from Gaza and committing to end the war under phase two?
The big problem from the Israeli point of view is that as long as Hamas remains in control of Gaza and has its military arm still functioning there, Israel doesn't want to end the war. Israel, of course, will not end the war as long as hostages remain in Gaza. And there's a very strong belief on the Israeli side, particularly in the government, that if they do end the war now, Hamas will only entrench its position, will gain in strength, and will continue to threaten Israel. This is why I think we're seeing a coalescing of the Arab world. We'll see this in the Arab summit that's coming up with the United Arab position, both on the need to end the war, bring the hostages home, and see a different governance, a Palestinian governance in Gaza, which would be acceptable and legitimate by the majority of Palestinians, and yet would no longer be a threat to Israel. This all has to be packaged in a political understanding that we're moving toward the two-state solution. And it's obvious that with the current Israeli government, that's not a reality that we can expect. So there needs to be political movement if we want to see the changes in Gaza that need to happen, because there's a humanitarian disaster there of more than 2 million homeless people. There needs to be an international effort, primarily a regional effort, to see how we bring this to a close that will lead to an end of the war, the hostages home, and a replacement of Hamas in Gaza.
If we get to the point, Javier, of reaching the deadlock that we seem to be getting close to as far as the negotiations are concerned, I want to ask you about Hamas' intentions with regard to disarmament, because it is one of the things that I've not been aware of, that they have said that they have been meeting the agreement, their side of the agreement, in terms of the ceasefire, but there doesn't appear, and they've even, as we know, said that they're prepared to step back from the administration of Gaza as well. What we've not seen are any clear statements about the removal of weapons and who those weapons would be handed to. Do you think that if Hamas was prepared to make a statement towards that, that might help to break the deadlock, or at least move the talks on a little bit?
To be honest, I don't think so. It wouldn't change much the Israeli calculations. Israel is not interested to have a legitimate Palestinian authority in Gaza. They've been investing on Palestinian division for almost 2 decades now in order to avoid getting to a position whereby negotiations on a two-state solution may happen. We have to keep adding context. Israel is not in favor of any solution that involves the fulfillment of Palestinian rights. And from that perspective, this dynamic of crisis that are being created, it's part of what Benjamin Netanyahu and his extremist coalition need. Let's remember that it's not only about Gaza. We have a huge escalation here in the occupied West Bank. We have announcements that Israel may be interested to move also into a conflict with Syria. We have 5 posts in southern Lebanon left in violation of the ceasefire deal with Lebanon. So we are talking about an Israeli government that is not looking for a political solution. It's looking simply to expand the crises in order to avoid getting into what any rational player here would go, which is go into a political solution with the rest of the Arab world and with Palestine in order to end occupation and fulfill the rights of everyone.
Francis, we've been talking about Israel's military goals, at least as far as the speculation with regard to that is concerned. Nevertheless, U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff is urging Israel to go through with phase 2 to ensure the return of the remaining hostages and the remaining captives and the remaining bodies of those who've died. How much of that do you think is a sign that we're not at a point where actually the goals of the U.S. and Israel are slightly diverging?
I hope that the United States retains the longer-term goal of, within the context it's always had, of peace and stability across the region, of a broader solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think that remains the goal of this administration. I don't know. I'm not a part of the administration, but it would seem to be, from everything they say, the United States' long-term objective is what they uphold. Clearly, that is not the goal. I won't say of Israel. I will say of Mr. Netanyahu and the right wing that he has been with. Other right-wing governments of Israel have accepted that goal. Mr. Rabin, and he paid for that with his life. We've had 2 other previous leaders of Israel, Ehud Barak and Olmert, who were prepared to move forward with a process that would have led to a long-term solution, a two-state solution. So we can't say that Israel always, out of hand, has rejected this, or even that the Israeli right have. However, it is clearly the long-term lifetime position of Mr. Netanyahu and his various coalition governments to reject a long-term solution. So I agree with what my other 2 colleagues in this interview have said. This Israeli government does not seek, in fact, rejects the idea of an end to the war. It needs to keep this campaign going on. And the United States clearly does not want that.
Javier, what's your reaction to that?
I don't think the problem is just this Israeli government. I mean, even the leader of the center left in Israel, Yair Golan, had a statement calling on people on Gaza to starve until the captives are returned to Israel. And it's not like we had several administrations before in Israel that were willing to end occupation and to fulfill the rights of the Palestinian people. Certainly not Ehud Barak and others as well. Perhaps under Ehud Olmert, it was much closer. But if we are talking into matters of policy, one of the reasons why the peace process collapsed and we are where we are is because no Israeli government ever endorsed the two-state solution as an official policy, but colonization and annexation of occupied territory or war crimes and crimes against humanity have been part of Israeli government policy for all those decades. So I think it's important to highlight always that in Israel there are people that want to move into a political process and would like to end Israeli occupation. But I think the policies we're seeing from Benjamin Netanyahu now have been paved by previous administrations, just like the policies of Donald Trump in the US have been paved by previous administrations, particularly by the disastrous Joe Biden administration.
Garshan, I mentioned at the top of the programme that you're a former peace and hostage negotiator. I want to draw on your experience from that. How does what we're seeing now in terms of the negotiations around the various stages of the ceasefire compare to negotiations that you've been privy to in the past? And the path that, I'm not expecting obviously a direct comparison, but just the way in which they are carried out?
Look, I think that it's important to note that when the current deal was presented by President Biden back in May, I came out with a statement saying that I thought it was a bad deal to begin with. It was a deal that doesn't bring an end to the war, doesn't return all the hostages, and would take months to carry out, with many, many exit points where both sides could breach the agreement all along the way. And that's, in fact, what we've seen. As a result of being approached by families of hostages back in August, I approached the Hamas leadership and asked for an alternative deal and arrived in an agreement that they even gave in writing in English and in Arabic for a deal for 3 weeks, in which time the war would end, Israel would withdraw from Gaza, all the hostages would be released in exchange for an agreed number and names of Palestinian prisoners, and we would move forward. Hamas even put in writing that they were willing to give up the governmental control of Gaza at that time in favor of a professional, civilian, technocratic government in Palestine. But there were no takers for that deal, not in Israel, not in Egypt and in Qatar, unless they were approached by Hamas, and not in the White House, who were simply too invested in the bad deal that they were negotiating. My understanding of the way that Hamas negotiates is that there's very little room for negotiations. There's room on the margins, but they put down very early in the game on what they want, what their demands are, and they stick to those positions. And that's what we've seen now. Hamas made a compromise when it entered into this deal, agreeing that the war would end only in phase 2, because prior to that, they were demanding that any agreement with them bring it immediately into the war. So they did make a compromise, but now they're seeing that that compromise was only on paper. It wasn't a real part of the deal from the Israeli side, not honoring the agreement that they made.
One of the key elements of the deal that was initially put forward by Donald Trump, of course, was that people had to leave Gaza in order for his rebuilding program to begin. Benjamin Netanyahu's halted humanitarian aid into Gaza yet again. Is this short-term, Gershon, do you think, to get leverage, to get Hamas to agree to the extension, or is there a longer-term leverage to try to force people to leave Gaza as part of that process?
Well, I think that Israel is working on both getting people to leave Gaza, but it's also using this as leverage, the military pressure on Hamas, the threat of renewing the war, in order to get Hamas to give in and release hostages without changing the deal, without increasing the number of prisoners to be released, and not agreeing to the war to end. But Israel forgets that Hamas has leverage also over Israel, and those are the 59 hostages they're holding, of which about half of them are believed to be alive. So that's a quite serious matter of leverage on Israeli society that Benjamin Netanyahu seems to care a little about, willing to sacrifice the lives of the hostages in favor of him remaining in power. That's at least what it seems to be.
Francis, we know that Egypt and Qatar and the United States are all acting as guarantors for this ceasefire deal. This seems precisely the kind of circumstance in which Hamas and Israel would go to those mediators and those guarantors in order to be able to get them to move the ceasefire process forward. Can you describe to us what the limitations might be that Egypt and Qatar, and to some extent the United States, are working in when it comes to the being guarantors of the ceasefire?
Well, there's nothing for the guarantors to guarantee unless the parties themselves come to the conclusion that they must agree at least on a ceasefire, if not an end to the war. there's nothing there to be guaranteed. And I don't know what a guarantee would mean other than the sort of full faith and credit, the full moral force. Clearly, it seems to me the United States is not likely to put forces on the ground. I can't imagine that Qatar, even the Egyptians, would wish to do it other than a symbolic minor way along the border. So, short version is there's no agreement to guarantee. They're serving simply as mediators, offering their good offices, and that's about as far as it's going to go until the dynamics change. We have an irresistible force and an immovable object. It makes it a very challenging situation.
Javier, we were hearing earlier on in the program about the fact that we're entering the holy month of Ramadan and how that's being marked in Gaza. We have to remember, of course, that there are hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza who are trying to live through this as the negotiations, stall at the moment. Just talk to us briefly about what any sort of delay means for the lives of people in Gaza.
We have to understand that even under the conditions or obligations of phase one, Israel violated, for example, the entry of tents. We got, I think, 10% of the amount of tents that were supposed to enter there. Mobile homes did not enter Gaza as well. And in any case, we have less aid entering than what's needed in the condition of the humanitarian disaster we have in Gaza. If you add to this that we have now the holy month of Ramadan, it's clearly an invitation for things to continue to escalate. And let's remember that it's not only Gaza. In the northern West Bank, we have over 40,000 people that are displaced, and the conditions for the connectivity between Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, it's also very complicated at this stage.
Gershon, we've got the Arab Summit being held in a couple of days. I understand that there is an Israeli delegation that has been sent to Cairo to have a look at that proposal that's being prepared by Egypt and is going to be presented at the Arab Summit at that point. Is there any likelihood, do you think, that Israel is going to find anything within that proposal that they're going to find acceptable and workable?
No, I don't think so. I think my understanding is that the Arab leaders who met on the farm of Mohammed bin Salman a few days ago came to a collective agreement on what needs to be done, which includes ending the war and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, but it also includes a political framework for advancing a genuine two-state solution. And we see the power of Saudi Arabia right now as one of the leaders of the Arab world demanding that not only there be a path toward a Palestinian state, but a Palestinian state is required in order for the Saudis to normalize relations with Israel, which is something that Israel is very keen about. The Saudis are now more committed to that Palestinian state than ever before. And I think they found agreement with all the other Arab leaders, including the Abraham Accord states of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco, and others who are agreeing that there needs to be a swift change in Arab policy toward the state of Israel in order to see that this war ends and that there is a political formula that moves us forward out of this conflict. It will require a change of leadership in the region. I think both in Israel and in Palestine, a change of leadership will be required in order for us to actually get into a genuine political process toward a Palestinian state.
Francis, in terms of what Gershon was just mentioning there, with regards to changes in leadership, changes in focus for Arab nations, what do you think is going to be the longer-term impact in terms of Gulf politics, geopolitics in the Gulf region as a result of what we're seeing now? Almost irrelevant as to whether or not there is actually a ceasefire, even just based on what we know now about the situation that Israel and Palestine find themselves in.
Well, I guess I fully subscribe to what Gershon has said. There needs to be a change of leadership in the two parties to the conflict. And with, as I said earlier, both parties effectively having lost. It's a long-term sort of loss in the making, but neither side has won. And the loss of both sides does not, in this case, imply the win of the other side. Both sides have lost. Hamas has nowhere to go. It's a goner as such. Palestinian resistance is not over by any means, if that's what is considered to be the enemy. But Hamas is not going to be ruling a Palestinian state or any version of it in the long run. Netanyahu, in the long run, I think keeps up what he's doing because he has consequences to face at home once there's any settlement of this. The fact that so many of Israel's interests have suffered under his pursuit of this conflict in the way he has. And he was the one who explicitly promoted Hamas to divide the Palestinians. His loss is there. So from what Gershon has said, I believe there's some reason to be optimistic that one way or another there will be leadership changes both in Israel and on the Palestinian side. On the Gulf side and Egypt, it seems to me the Arab states are stable, and in terms of their leadership and their processes for changing their leadership, and they all have come to a kind of consensus on accommodation with Israel long, long ago, starting with President Sadat and building over the years through the Ibrahim Accords. I don't see that changing. I see, if anything, it coalescing and strengthening as this horrible conflict between the Palestinian players, let us say, and the Israelis plays out.
Javier, I want to come to you just for a final...
In a terrible way that
Francis, I do apologize for interrupting you, but I just want to get a last question from Javier. In terms of how Palestinians themselves, both on the West Bank and in Gaza, are seeing the situation that is unfolding in Gaza, do you think that Palestinians do see any sort of optimism for a future in Gaza? Do they see a ceasefire, or is a return to war inevitable?
I would like just to make 3 points. I think many people are very concerned, not just about a return to the genocidal war in Gaza, but also what's happening here in the West Bank. And I think Palestinians feel totally abandoned, particularly by the Western world. The Europeans just a few days ago welcomed Gideon Saar, the Israeli foreign minister, with a red carpet in Brussels, while his boss is wanted by the International Court of Justice. When Palestinians go to international organizations and try to make points through diplomacy and legal organizations, we are not supported. We have European countries welcoming Benjamin Netanyahu, allowing him to go through their airspace, like France, like Italy, like Greece. So from that perspective, I think Palestinians see how the international community are in this crisis, a policy crisis. They insist on old formulas that have failed completely. Normalization has been a disaster for the Palestine. Israel has toughened its positions, it has been going way more radical after normalization with a few Arab countries. And
Javier,
so
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for joining us. And thanks to all our guests, Xavier Abu Eid, Francis Ricciardone and Gershon Baskin. And thanks to you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Rob Matheson, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.